Hello and welcome. This is my second video on astrology. So today, in honor of the sun moving into Scorpio, so the Scorpio season just started, I wanted to talk a bit about a person who has a huge emphasis in their chart about Scorpio, and that is Martin Scorsese. So recently we've had a documentary come out about Martin on Apple TV. Apple TV Plus, I think it's called, and it's a very nice documentary. Martin talks about his life in detail, about his childhood, and I thought it's a really good learning experience to look at his chart while watching the documentary. And I've discovered some really interesting things. He talks about his life and his childhood with a lot of self-awareness, and everything he says matches his chart really well. So it's really likely that we have a very good birth time for him. And the chart really applies to his life. So Martin is one of the most famous movie directors, probably from the US, and probably one of the most famous ones in the world. He's been accused a lot of having a fascination with violence, and we're gonna see why. So he has a lot of planets in Scorpio. He has Mars in domicile in Scorpio, Mercury in Scorpio, the Sun, Venus in Scorpio, and they're all very close to the IC. So the IC is the point opposite to the midheaven, and it's one of the four very strong points in astrology. So beside the ascendant, descendant, and the midheaven, the IC is also a very strong point that makes planets around it very active. So all the planets in his fourth house, fourth whole sign house in Scorpio, will be very, very active. So Martin is a Leo rising. His ascendant is in Leo. It's very close to Chiron. It's also very close to the north node of the moon, and somewhat close to Pluto, but still 21 degrees away, but they're still co-present in the same sign, and we're going to see why that matters. And the planet ruling his ascendant is in the fourth whole sign house in Scorpio. And that would indicate in astrology that a lot about his life is a lot of the things in his life are centered around his family, because whatever house the ruler of the ascendant is in, that will show what your life is centered about. And for him, a lot of his life is centered around his family. And from his documentary, we know that one of his earliest memories that he was talking about right at the beginning of the documentary is being fed in a high chair as a baby. And I think very few people have memories so far back in life from when they were fed as a baby. I think he was 2 or 3 years old. He later talked about memories from when he was about 3 years old, so he must have been younger than 3 when he had this memory. And I think this has a lot to do with the sun being in the fourth whole sign house. The fourth house in astrology has to do with your childhood, and the sun illuminates whatever area it is in. And usually in the house that the sun is in, people are quite conscious, and they have a heightened awareness, and they have an innate intelligence to deal with the topics of that house. So around his fourth whole sign house, he had an innate intelligence about dealing with those things. He has other planets there, so a lot of the life areas for him will go back to the fourth whole sign house. He talked about having a pretty large family, so he had a lot of family members. They're all living in his neighborhood, living around him. He was raised at the beginning of his life in Corona in New York, which again shows how loaded that fourth house is for him. A lot of planets there, that would mean a lot of resources. I very often see planets in astrology as resources, and having a strong fourth sign house, it means you have a lot of resources there. You know, he had a very large family all living in his neighborhood. So his neighborhood is also very closely connected to his fourth sign house, and in his chart, the neighborhood is given by the third whole sign house, which is in Libra. It has Neptune in there, and it's ruled by Venus, which goes back to his family in Scorpio. And he said actually that he remembers Corona, New York as being paradise as a child. And that has a lot to do with Neptune being there, right? because Neptune is gonna indicate what area of our life we idealize in a way. He also speaks about a very early memory. Beside living in a paradise, according to him, as a child, he says that one of his first memories is that of his father getting into a physical fight with his landlord. So there is some fighting and there's some tension right around his living situation, and that we already see that Mars being so prominent and so strong in Scorpio in the fourth sign house, fourth whole sign house. So the fourth house it's also called the house of the father, and having a father who's willing to be physically violent it does match with that Mars being in there. He said it was a very traumatic event. His family was very protective of each other, so it was not just his father getting into a physical fight with his landlord, but his family also intervened and tried to help. He talked also about his family being very mistrustful of other people, so probably this is why the fight started to begin with. He said his family was very mistrustful of the government or of the people they were involved with, because unless they were not, if they were not Italian, his family was quite mistrustful, and if they were Italian, they had to be Sicilian, otherwise they would be mistrustful. So that's what Martin told us in the documentary. And this is another Scorpio experience. So Scorpio can be quite mistrustful. I don't think Scorpio is a sign that trusts people easily. It is a fixed water sign, so it has very fixed feelings about things. So if Scorpio feels a certain way about something, it's very difficult to sort of change the way that they feel about it. They're quite stubborn. So Taurus in astrology also has a reputation for being very stubborn, because Taurus is fixed earth. So it's an earth sign and it's a fixed sign. That is the modality of the sign. That's what it's called. And because it's earth, it's the slowest of all of the signs, and probably the second slowest would be water. So if Scorpio feels a certain way about things, it's very difficult to change that. He also talked about being aware of very interesting power dynamics in his neighborhood. So he knew there were some powerful crime families, as he called them. So that was probably the mafia that was in New York at that time. And after the fight that his father got into with the landlord, his father was backed by some powerful people, and his landlord was backed by some powerful people, and they talked things out, and the conclusion of that was that Martin and his family had to move out of Corona, New York. So he said he saw that experience as being sort of cast out of paradise. And if you look at his chart, his third house is ruled by Venus, which is in Scorpio. So long term, even though at the beginning you probably experience your third house as whatever planet you have in there. So he experienced Neptune in the third house in his neighborhood. He thought it's a paradise. It was really beautiful. It was ideal. But longer term, the ruler of the third house, Venus, will have the last word, sort of. And Venus is in Scorpio. And the neighborhood that Martin and his family had to move into, it was a lot less nice. He said that his new neighborhood became a place of fear. There were children fighting in the street, throwing garbage at each other. He said that the streets were full of people who had substance abuse issues. And he said many times when he was walking through the city, through his neighborhood at night, it looked like the night of the living dead. That's what he said, which again is such a Scorpio experience of your neighborhood, which it's a very interesting way to describe that Venus and Scorpio in the fourth whole sign house, right? So Venus usually, if you'd be in Taurus, you'd be faced with really beautiful things which are in accordance with Venus's nature. But Venus in Scorpio, Venus will be faced with things that are contrary to his nature. So it's not beautiful things. Scorpio, if we think of the time of year that Scorpio rules, it's around Halloween. People watch scary movies about all sorts of murders and dead bodies coming alive and zombies and whatnot. And describing your neighborhood as a scene from the Night of the Living Dead is very it's a very apt description of his chart as well. Martin also had some health issues, so he wanted. This is relevant because it's an experience of his childhood. So the fourth house for him, it is pretty strong, but it's still ruled by Mars, which is one of the malefics. So there are difficulties around the fourth whole sign house. His health was not very good as a child. So if we want to look at somebody's health in astrology, we look at the moon, but the condition of the moon for him is not too bad, or the ascendant or the sixth whole sign house. So the sixth whole sign house is empty. It's ruled by Saturn, very close to Uranus in Gemini. Um, Gemini is an air sign. There are some texts in astrology that say that having Saturn in Gemini can indicate some problems with your breathing or communication ability. But the more interesting thing is that ascendant being very close to Chiron, because Chiron very often in astrology, a lot of people ignore it, but I think it's a really relevant point because it shows an area in your life where you have an inability to do something, right? And having the ascendant so close to Chiron, it can show something about your own body that is difficult and you cannot really improve. And having the ascendant close to Chiron, for him, probably was related to this experience of wanting to play with other children, but because he had asthma, he couldn't. So he was forced to stay inside and look at them play, right? He was sort of ostracized. So it is a Saturnian experience. So it is related to Saturn ruling his sixth whole sign house. It is a chronic condition. He couldn't really improve, but he got better with age. So again, Saturn comes up because usually the things that Saturn rules, they get better as you age. The people who were showing up in the documentary were saying they're very grateful for the fact that Martin had asthma because they think that uh, that health issue for him actually drove him to appreciate movies. And we know, for example, in the summer it was really hot. There was no AC in New York anywhere apart from movie theaters. And Martin's father would take him to movie theaters. So it was the only place where he could breathe. So we see his father already being sort of involved with his career, which shows a relationship between his 10th whole sign house ruled by Venus and his 4th whole sign house ruled by Mars. Mars and Venus, they are co-present, so there is a relationship between them. They are co-present in Scorpio. And his father was perhaps unknowingly very instrumental to Martin's career because he took him to movie theaters. Martin was already very observant of his neighborhood and of the things that were happening around him, and that probably has something to do with the sun being in the 4th whole sign house. He was very conscious and aware of what was going on in his family and in his neighborhood. The relationship between the Sun and Venus is also very interesting here because they're very close to each other, less than 1 degree from each other, which in astrology is called the cazimi. It's just a conjunction, but it's a very close conjunction when we say that Venus is in the heart of the Sun. So it shows again a heightened insight into Venus-related things and a heightened insight about his neighborhood in this case, in this particular case, because Venus rules his neighborhood for him. So already from his childhood, he was very observant. His father took him to movie theaters. He was the only place where he could breathe. So, a lot of the things that were happening in his life led him very obviously on the path of, starting to make movies and being interested in movies. In the new neighborhood that Martin moved into, he knew about 5 mafia families that were operating in there. I'm not sure if it was 5 families operating in the whole of New York, but at least in his area, he was aware of 5 of them. His father apparently was involved with the crime families, and he said that once the mafia does a favor for you, then you're going to have to do favors for them, and it goes on like that for years. So he asked Martin to never accept any favor from the mafia because he's never going to be able to get rid of him. So we see, there's a lot of conversation and a lot of talk about crime. Somehow Martin was sort of shielded from all this. But this conversation is this somewhat scary. They can be quite traumatic and quite terrifying, right? Terrifying conversations about crime. We see that Mercury and Mars connection in Scorpio in the fourth whole sign house for him. Um, Martin's mother said in the documentary that the way the family was raised was that if they see something in the neighborhood, they shouldn't say anything about it. So his mother basically prohibited him from talking or speaking out about anything he would see, and he probably took that advice, and this is why he didn't really get into any trouble himself. He was protected. He also, one thing that I didn't talk about in his chart, but that is very relevant, is that both the Sun and Venus, they make a very close trine with an exalted Jupiter in Cancer in the 12th whole sign house. So even though Jupiter is in the 12th whole sign house, usually if it makes an aspect with some other planet, it's going to send some of the 12th house significations to those planets that it aspects. But because it is Jupiter and it's a benefic planet and it's so strong in Cancer, it did probably have um, a protective quality for Martin, because it is directly involved with the sun, which is not, the sun is already quite important in astrology, but because it is the ruler of the ascendant, is twice as important for Martin. And having Jupiter in a trine to that sun actually shows a decent amount of protection. He said that he saw some terrible things in his neighborhood. Violence was imminent all the time. He said at one time he saw a guy lying in the street with his hands cut off, and one of his friends put a pencil in his head to make sure that whether or not there's a bullet hole in there. So this is a very gruesome scene. He said that he lived on the street or around the street where bodies were being dumped by the mafia. His uncle was also involved in crime. He used to sell alcohol illegally. So there's a lot of crime and there's a lot of terrifying things that he experienced, and that again shows, that very strong Scorpio emphasis. So there are a lot of people. My fourth whole sign house is also Scorpio, and it is ruled by Mars in Gemini. So there have been also conversations within my own family about crime, because my father used to be a police officer. So he would often talk about some pretty disturbing scenes or things that people have done that he had to deal with. I'm not necessarily saying that every time when you have planets in Scorpio or you have a strong Scorpio emphasis in your chart, there's going to be some involvement with crime, but it is possible, and it does happen quite often, that there is some talk about it at least, or some more involvement than average. Another quite interesting example to look at is the period of Martin's life when he was interested in being a priest. So this was already later in life. It's not about his childhood. At some point, he became interested in priesthood because he went to church, and he said that was a relief for him, a relief from all the terrible things that he was exposed to in his neighborhood, the difficult conversations and things that he had going on in his family, with his uncle being involved in crime and everything. He saw the church as being a place where he was shielded from all that, and he felt safe. And he said it was a relief for him being there, and he wanted to. He was on track to become a priest at some point, but he gave up on that. So this is relevant because that Mars is also ruling the ninth whole sign house, which has to do with religion, right? So the ninth whole sign house is Aries for Martin, and it is ruled by that very strong Mars in Scorpio in the fourth whole sign house. And beside the ninth house being related to religion, usually ritual and religious ritual is ruled by Venus. Traditionally, in general, it is ruled by Venus, and the Venus is very close to the sun. So you see there's some attraction to a religious ritual. And the third whole sign house also is related to religious ritual, and it being ruled by Venus, there's even more emphasis on that, but that didn't really last very long. There's somebody in the documentary who said that Martin had a heavy eye for women, so there was no way that they saw him as becoming a priest. At some point, Martin started university, so he went to NYU, and he said that the people he looked up to in his life were his father, the priest, and then a person from NYU who was who was speaking very passionately about filmmaking. So we can see some very strong elements in his life, right? So he was looking up to his father, which has to do with that very strong fourth whole sign house. He was looking up to priests, which has to do with that Venus and Mars again, ruling the ninth, and Venus ruling the third, which has to do with ritual and priesthood. And then we see an inclination to make movies, movies are an art form in a way. So his career ends up becoming about movies. Um, his career would be indicated by the 10th whole sign house where the midheaven is, and his career and achievements and aspirations in life, they're ruled by Venus, and Venus is in the 4th whole sign house. Um, very close to that sun. So Venus is Kazimi, the sun, which shows, that your career, probably in your achievements, they're an integral part of who you are. So Martin started to make movies once he got to NYU, and he had a sort of privilege in New York, in the area he was in. He was able to shoot movies in places that no other people would have access to, because only because you'd have to ask for permission from the mob to get access to some rooftops where he would film, and people described in the documentary that he would have access to those places. And you can see again the help that Martin gets from that Jupiter in the 12th whole sign house in Cancer, that exalted Jupiter. So Jupiter being exalted, usually it can indicate and it can show people in his life that are in very high positions. So when a planet is exalted in astrology, it is related to people who get a lot of awards or who have a very high position in life. So because his sun, which represents himself and it rules his ascendant, it is a representative for his nativity, it's getting a lot of help from that Jupiter in the 12th whole sign house. And this experience of him, sort of getting permission to film in lots of places, because he had a good relationships with the mob, it speaks of that very strong trine in there. His first breakthrough movie actually was Mean Streets. And there was a guy in that movie called Johnny Boy. He was a character based on one of the people Martin knew from his neighborhood called Salvatore, a guy that Martin just couldn't understand how he wouldn't get killed. He was quite lucky as well. So we again see, that Venus also receives a trine from Jupiter, and Venus can represent characters from your neighborhood. He said that many times this guy from his neighborhood would get in a situation where he might get killed by somebody, but he never got killed. Martin's father, would come in and usually talk things through talking. He would be able to help. So we see, that strong Mercury. Mercury is not particularly strong, but again, is also getting a trine from Jupiter, and we see his father, being able to talk to these people to help Salvador to not get killed. Martin he said that he portrayed in this movie a world of intense male relationships. So these are his words, and we can see again the strong emphasis on Scorpio. So Scorpio is very often related to intensity and intense male relationships. That Mars in Scorpio, that emphasis on Scorpio, that's something that he portrayed in his movies. His movies and the things that he creates, mean streets was one of his achievements. So you'd be related to his 10th whole sign house ruled by Venus. He got in a bit of trouble for this movie because he portrayed a lot of violence, and we start to see what it means for Venus to be in the sign of its exile or in detriment in Scorpio, right? And Venus Venus's function is to beautify, to bring beauty into this world, to make art, to make connections between people, to create harmonious relationships. And because it rules the 10th whole sign house and it rules Taurus, Venus's function in Martin's career would be about making art, right? And Venus has to make art in a place in Scorpio where it does not have the tools that are in accordance with its nature. So he made art out of very violent and very difficult scenes. So this is what Scorpio is about. Scorpio is a lot about talking about difficult emotions, dealing with difficult things. This is why it's one of the water signs. The water signs are all quite emotional. They have a good emotional intelligence, but it is ruled by Mars. So we have difficult emotions in essence in Scorpio. And the reason Martin kept getting into trouble, not just for the movie Mean Streets, but for many of his movies, he kept getting into trouble for portraying violence and portraying difficult things that humans deal with. That speaks and that explains and shows very well what it means for a planet to be in the sign of its exile. So Venus in exile in Scorpio, she has to do art to make beauty out of very difficult scenes. Martin talked about presenting genuine and truthful violence, and I think this is why he sort of got away with it, so that if Venus didn't have all the help in his chart from Jupiter in Cancer, or if he was on Cazimi the Sun, which would show a heightened awareness, self-awareness, or awareness about art, Venus has a lot of mitigating circumstances in his chart, which is why probably his movies ended up being so successful, even though at the beginning he felt a little bit of backlash or he ran into trouble. Long term, his movies were quite successful, and a lot of them were quite successful. And in his chart, if we had to predict, anything about his career, we would talk about some difficulties at the beginning because Venus is not in a good place in Scorpio. So there will be difficulties, but thanks to that trine, and thanks to the mitigating factors that Venus has long term, and probably in total, we would be able to conclude that things would be quite good. So I think these are all the things that I wanted to talk about regarding his chart. This is becoming a pretty long video already. I think this is a really interesting chart to sort of show what Scorpio is all about. And especially for him having, a Scorpio 4th house, you see what it is like to have a family that is very Scorpionic. And not everybody's going to have the mitigating circumstances for the 4th house that Martin has. This is a pretty fortunate or auspicious chart, which is why he had the success and he has the magnitude in this world that he has, and is one of the most famous and well-respected directors. Hello again. So this is me after I started to edit the video. So the camera just died on me because it overheated, so the ending part wasn't recorded properly. So a couple of things that I wanted to say in closing. One thing that I forgot to mention, and I realized while I was recording the video, is that I never really explained why that Jupiter in Cancer is so important for Martin Scorsese. And the reason for that is because we wouldn't expect a planet in the 12th house to be very fortunate for somebody, because the 12th house usually, it is traditionally and in ancient times, it was called the house of bad spirit. And a planet in the 12th house usually brings misfortune, it brings loss, it brings problems around mental health probably. But in this case, because Jupiter has so many mitigating circumstances in Martin's chart, so it is in the sign of Cancer, it is ruled by the moon, and the moon is in the sign of Pisces, which is ruled by Jupiter. And in astrology, this is called mutual reception, and is a very helpful condition for both of these planets, even though both of them are in difficult houses. So the 8th and the 12th are both difficult houses in astrology. But because of this mitigating circumstance, which is a mutual reception between Jupiter and the moon, the condition of Jupiter is improved quite a lot. And overall, Jupiter is also in the sign of its exaltation, beside having a mutual reception with the moon. And that also improves this condition. So if Jupiter was in its own sign, so in Sagittarius or in Pisces or in the sign of its exaltation, its condition is improved again. One interesting thing about this Jupiter is also that it is stationing retrograde, so it is stationing and preparing its retrograde motion in the chart. So that means that its energy is also intensified. So it is a very special Jupiter in a very special position that would normally not be super helpful. This is also a night chart, so Martin is born somewhere in the middle of night, at midnight, right? So the sun is very close to the IC. That means that it's well past sunset. So Jupiter would normally not be a very helpful planet, but because it's so well positioned and it has so many mitigating circumstances, it's able to support his sun very well in the fourth whole sign house in Scorpio. And probably a lot of his, with famous people and people who are very successful, usually what we see when we look at their chart is that they have planets that are very well dignified, right? So that both the moon, Jupiter, and Mars, they're quite well dignified. That moon has a mutual reception with Jupiter in Cancer. Jupiter is exalted. That Mars is in old domicile, so very strong in the fourth whole sign house, which makes the whole house very strong. And people who have planets in domicile and planets that are exalted, they usually stand out in one way or another in this world. And also people who have planets in fall or in detriment or in exile, sometimes they do manage to stand out, sometimes in a negative way, but sometimes by overcoming the huge difficulties that those placements would bring. So this is pretty much all I wanted to say in closing about Martin's chart. I think it's a really beautiful example of what Scorpio means in astrology and what the fourth whole sign house means in astrology. I'll see you in the next video.